I want us to continue our series on life of Moses, the biblical Moses that Hollywood forgot. The book of Exodus. Previously, in Exodus, the biblical Moses that Hollywood forgot, what we covered last time was an introduction to the laws of Passover and to the evening of Passover. We took a break from the plagues and the narrative structure to give some background regarding what the rules are regarding how to observe the very first Passover and then subsequent Passover as well. And which, of course, involved taking a perfect 1-year-old or up to 1-year-old lamb, living with it for 4 days to examine and make sure that that lamb is without blemish or spot, that it is a perfect lamb that is worthy of being sacrificed on behalf of the Lord, given to the Lord. It's a perfect gift. It's not second place, second choice. It's first choice, prime. And that lamb was to be sacrificed at the doorposts or in front of the doorposts of the house. The lamb's blood was to be captured in a basin, taken, and hyssop was taken to paint the doorpost and lintel of the home, so that when the 10th plague came, when God sent the angel of death to destroy the firstborn of all Egypt, he would pass over the Jewish people who had the Hebrews who had the lamb's blood on the door. He would see the blood and he would pass over them. We talked about the necessary requirements, the indisputable, undilutable, non-negotiable requirements of eating Passover, and that was to have the Passover lamb, and along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs to remind the Hebrews of the bitterness of slavery. So these are the 3 non-negotiables according to Jewish law and custom in the time of the Bible. And thereafter was the lamb, the matzah, or the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs. We talked about the 10th and final plague being the final showdown, the final act in this giant smackdown between God, our God, the God of the Hebrews, and the 80 or so gods in the Egyptian pantheon. This was going to be the 10th plague, and God, through the previous 9 plagues, and along with this climax, like knocking over 10 pins in a bowling alley, knocking over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, onward through 9, this would be the final pin that God would knock over, creating an unforgettable strike against the Egyptians that will evoke a response. And that response, at long last, will be that the Hebrews will be freed from their bitter bondage. We talked about the prohibition of leaven, so that there is no leaven, that which makes the yeast rise, that which makes the dough rise, rather, the yeast, the leavening agent, no leaven in the home. It is the feast, a 7-day festival of unleavened bread. Passover, remember, is just, a lot of you were surprised last week to hear this, but Passover was only a 1-day holiday. And that holiday ends at sundown after the Passover lambs have been sacrificed. What immediately commences when the sun goes down and the new day, according to the Jewish calendar, begins, is a 7-day festival called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when the Jewish people are commanded to eat unleavened bread, and forbidden to not only eat Captain Crunch, Oreos, Wonder Bread, and delicious bagels, whether or not they have a schmear on them or not. They're forbidden. They not only can't eat it, but they cannot have it in their homes. It's not to be even found in their domiciles. And here we see the Jewish people having a communal burning. It's called the burning of the chametz. Not Comet, the cleanser, but chametz, the leaven. They are burning the chametz, the leaven. And of course, I just think it's a lot more convenient that the rabbis have ruled that you can sell your leaven to a Gentile neighbor and get it back at the end. But this is one way to do it, for sure. And you know for sure it's never coming back. We talked about the hyssop. The hyssop was used to apply the blood on the door. And again, this is where we left off, the blood on the door, the judgment of God about to strike the land of Egypt, and the command, of course, that when these events occur, you must pass this down to the next generation. This is the whole point of the Passover Seder, which we'll participate in April. At Passover time, we'll have a Passover Seder together. The whole point of this event is to communicate from one generation to the next the great works of God, to communicate a historical intervention in the course of Jewish history on behalf of God's chosen people. And we pick up the narrative in verse 29 of chapter 12. Now it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. We suddenly return to the narrative, and Moses plunges us, the readers, right into the narrative from the legislation, the rules about eating the Passover, passing it down for generation to generation. All of a sudden, we're plunged back into the narrative, and it's the midnight hour. And this 10th plague suddenly begins to roil the nation. Not one home was left unaffected by the abrupt loss of all the firstborn males. And that extends from the royal court of Pharaoh, the highest, to the lowest, to the prison house. And each family loses at least one member as firstborn sons and fathers and grandfathers are suddenly struck down. Even the firstborn of the cattle are killed. Those holding to a miraculous intensification of natural phenomena theory cannot explain how this strikes just the firstborn males. I want us to dim the lights, and I want us to see how this plays out in one of Hollywood's presentations. Let's put our attention to the screen. That was the Prince of Egypt. It's a cartoon. And yet, even an animated feature captures magnificently the events as described in the text of Exodus and adds an emotional component that, upon first read, might not necessarily be evident. it's important to remember how devastating this plague was. Every family is affected on a multi-generational level. I mean, the Egyptians, they loved their children too. And the freedom of the Jewish people comes at a tremendous cost for the Egyptians. And the grace of our God in preserving the Jewish people, the Hebrews, the Israelites, from the angel of death's ministrations as he went throughout the land, bringing death to every household, should resound off the page and into our hearts. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. Not some, not most. There was no area of Egypt except for Goshen and except for those homes in Goshen that had the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel of the home. All his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Now, there's no virus that's smart enough to target the firstborn of all the Egyptians, bypassing the Hebrews and making sure to strike the animals as well. There's no such thing. There's no natural phenomenon for what happened in Egypt, what's described in this text. No smart virus did this. The Lord did this. And then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, "Rise up, get out." Two commands. Rise up and get out. In other words, be gone. Rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel. This is the first time that Pharaoh has called the Hebrews by their name as a nation. It's the first recognition that we have in the text. That Pharaoh recognizes that the Jewish people are not just his property, are not just his slaves. He acknowledges them as a nation, the sons of Israel. And we're brought back full circle to Genesis and to Joseph and his success and the Pharaoh at that time, his big boss, telling Joseph to bring his family, bring Israel, Jacob, and his sons. And so we have a closing of the wheel. We have a closing off of the circle. Both you and the sons of Israel. And go, worship the Lord as you have said. The hand of the Lord is the only satisfactory explanation for these actions. God promised judgment, and God delivered judgment. A sufficient level of judgment that Pharaoh was finally unable to do anything but acquiesce to God's will and to acquiesce with great passion. So one final encounter. You'll remember that the last encounter Pharaoh had with Moses, just a few verses back, earlier chapter, he said, "Beware that you see my face again. If you see my face again, you will surely die." Pharaoh, who made that solemn pronouncement, now contradicts himself. He contradicts his own oath never again to allow Moses into his presence. And he says, rise up and get out and go. It's an urgent string of imperatives, all conveying his heart's desire, the force of that desire. He's got one thing on his mind. That's that the Hebrews leave Egypt. Not only is he allowing the Hebrews to leave in order to worship the Lord, he actually is demanding that they do so. But this time, no qualifications. This time, no compromise. Take all your people, everyone, the young, the old. Take all your flocks, all your herds. No qualifications. Just go. Just go. Take both your flocks and your herds, as you have said. So do just as you have always asked me to do. I'm finally saying yes. And go. And bless me also. Perhaps the biggest concession of all was that the king of Egypt's final words to Moses are a request for his blessing. A final acknowledgement that Moses and Moses' God are superior to Pharaoh and his pantheon of 80 deities. Don't miss the drama that screams from these verses. The gods are upside down indeed. They have been defeated. They have been shown to be impotent, including Pharaoh himself, the living God of Egypt, unable to protect even his own firstborn son. Egypt, Pharaoh, Egyptian pantheon have been defeated decisively, conclusively. And for all those who read this story for 3,500 years now, permanently defeated. You don't see a lot of people today in this ecumenical time that we live in. We don't see a lot of people who subscribe to the temple of Ra or Hathor or Isis or any of these Egyptian gods. They're kaput. The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we will all be dead. If you stay any longer among us, the entire population of Egypt might eventually be exterminated. How much damage has already been done? So not only is Pharaoh commanding that the people leave, driving them out, but the Egyptian people are finally urging the Hebrews to leave as well. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls bound up in the clothes on their shoulders. This is a historical explanation regarding the unleavened bread. And so if you're looking for an explanation as to why we have a feast of unleavened bread, you have not one explanation, but two. One is that God commanded it. Second reason is that armies move on their stomachs, and in their haste to leave on what was the first day of the 7-day festival of unleavened bread, the Hebrews grabbed the only food that was on hand, their as yet unleavened bread dough. They baked the dough, or formed the dough, into cakes, hoisted the pans up on their shoulders. The sun, as they marched out of Egypt, baked the cakes into matzah, unleavened bread. This is the original instance in recorded history of fast food to go. Jewish invention. And the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. So they let him have their request. And so they plundered the Egyptians. The Hebrews had been instructed, to remember, by Moses, to ask their Egyptian neighbors for silver, for gold, for clothing. It's not borrowed, because the Hebrews, they ain't returning, right? That's right. And all free, but actually not free at all. They were long overdue, back wages for all their slave labors, and they do indeed collect. Now we move to the departure. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Rameses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. Now, this is the first day, remember, this is the first day of unleavened bread. And so the initial leg of the Exodus spans the treasure city of Rameses to Succoth. Take a look, okay? Actually, I wanted to point something out to you before we look at the map. I want you to look at the number 600,000 men. If you have 600,000 men, and this is what's taught in most traditional churches, and I have taught this myself, and in fact, I lean on this number in the commentary that I wrote on Exodus. 600,000 men. Now, if you extrapolate to their wives and their children, then you get a minimum number of 2 million, 2.5 million. And there are ways to allow for 2 million or 2 million plus Hebrews to depart from Egypt, but it really does create a problem logistically, historically, about moving that number of people. It's always one of the criticisms that the scoffers, the doubters, who say this is a fairy tale, that they bring up. You can't really make the numbers work. You can make the numbers work, but it's difficult, and you have to do a little bit of stretching and acrobatics to actually make 2 or 2.5 million people work. But what is a person who takes the Bible seriously to do if you look at the geography and historically look at Egypt and the number of Egyptians that there would have been in the land at the time, and the Middle East, the whole Middle East? What do? How are you supposed to? There is a solution for it, and this is the solution that I am now adhering to. I think it's the most reasonable solution. The word that's translated as thousand, Aleph in Hebrew, it doesn't need and often does not mean thousand. Okay? As we find in this particular verse in Judges 6:15, look what Gideon says. He said to God, O Lord, how shall I deliver Israel? Behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. So the term family is the same word Aleph. So my family, my clan, in other words, it would not make sense to say my 1,000 is the least in Manasseh. And that wouldn't make sense at all. So we read this term in context, and in Judges 6:15, not that far removed from the time of Exodus and the writing of Exodus, the word Aleph very clearly means family or clan. Here's another use of this in the one of the very next books, 1 Samuel chapter 10. Now, therefore, present yourself before the Lord by your tribes and by your Alephs, by your clans. So not by your tribes and your thousands, but by your tribes and your clans or your families. So going back now, I believe that the best way to take these numbers in Exodus is 600 clans. Okay, 600 clans or families. Now, how many does that actually make when you extrapolate to wives and children? tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, but not 2 million. I find this to be far more intellectually satisfying and historically appropriate based upon geography, history, etc., etc. And it doesn't do any damage whatsoever to the text. It doesn't compromise how we read the text. So again, 600 clans, 600 clans or families, okay, on foot aside from the children. So now, this is roughly the map. They make their way from Rameses to Succoth. This is here's this. They're making their way to here, just this area right here. Okay, so they depart on that first day. This is the initial day, and they are traveling with a mixed multitude. What does that mean, a mixed multitude? Does it mean a mixed up multitude? No, it's a mixed group. These are other non-Hebrew slaves. And just perhaps a few God-fearing Egyptians. Now, later on, the book of Numbers, it tells us that this group of Gentiles who are traveling along with the people of Israel, the Hebrews, are going to stir up trouble in the camp on the wilderness journey, but that's a whole nother sermon for a whole nother day. They baked the dough which they'd brought out of Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread, for it had not been leavened since they had been driven out of Egypt. They could not delay, nor they prepared any provisions for themselves. Once again, an explanation for the leavened bread. It's that important. Now, the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. This is the total duration of the Hebrews' sojourn in Egypt as both free men and slaves, from the time of Joseph and bringing the family all the way through this Passover night and this day of liberation. And at the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. The former slaves are pictured as hosts, not because they're going to throw a swinging party, but the word hosts means armies. They are viewed as the armies of Jehovah, the hosts of Jehovah, the hosts of Adonai, the hosts of Hashem, the armies of the Lord. And these armies of the Lord have received their marching orders, and they go. And they went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be observed for the Lord, for having brought them out. So now we go back to legislation. We are now interspersing the narrative event of Passover, of the 10th plague, of the Exodus, of the departure, with legislation, so that you do not miss and skip over the legislation. It's interwoven in the narrative, so it's hard to miss. It is a night to be observed for the Lord, for having brought them out from the land of Egypt. This night is for the Lord, to be observed by the sons of Israel throughout their generations. This seminal event, this epochal event in the history of the Jewish people, is to be a perpetual observance for the Jewish people. It is for whom? Not for the Jews and not for the Gentiles. The observance of the Seder, of the Passover meal, is for Jehovah. It's for the covenant God of Israel. It is to recognize him. It is to remember him. So there are a lot of Jewish people today who are more secular than religious. And yet, because Passover is such an important event, they will still have a Passover Seder. And they will still go, at least read through some version of a Haggadah. It may be the most leftist, liberal Haggadah that has to do with this or that. May never mention God. There are atheistic Jews and agnostic Jews who celebrate Passover, but they don't do it for the Lord. They do it to connect with the people, to connect with their history. It's their culture. But the Bible, this night is not set up as a night of Jewish culture. This night is not set up as a night to remember Jewish history. Not the 4th of July. This night is for Him. It's for the covenant God to remember what He did. Not what we went through, but what He brought us through. That's a very important distinction that is lost on a ton of people. Again, to celebrate the evening of Passover, to eat a Passover Seder, is not about celebrating or commemorating or remembering what we went through, but what He delivered us through. And that emphasis makes all the difference in the world. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner is to eat of it." So now there's a difference between the foreigner and the stranger. A foreigner is someone who happens to be in your land and is visiting. A non-Jew who is in your land and is just passing through. Maybe they're there to conduct business. Maybe they're there for political reasons. Maybe they're there as tourists. Yeah, but they are not to eat. If you are a foreigner, the Passover is not for you. No soup for you. Matzo ball soup for you. And every man's slave, purchased with money, after you've circumcised it, then he may eat of it. That's a slave who really likes matzo ball soup, right? The only way you can participate in this meal is to be circumcised, okay? That's a very high level of commitment to participate in the Passover. But no uncircumcised can participate in the Passover. It cannot be eaten by the Gentile resident alien. And you need these rules because you have this mixed multitude who are coming with them, right? So not everybody exiting Egypt in the Exodus are Jewish. A sojourner or a hired servant shall not eat of it unless he is circumcised, you'll see later. It is to be eaten in a single house. You are not to bring forth any of the flesh outside the house, nor are you to break any bones of it. So you have two rules that are laid down. First of all, it's got to be eaten in the confines of one house. What that means practically, there are no progressive Passover Seders traveling from home to home to home to home. No, one house only. And there's to be no eating of the ritual meal out on the porch or in the backyard. And the breaking of any bones of the lamb, prohibited. Of course, the Messianic significance of this rule is later highlighted in Scripture regarding our Messiah. As it was written, not one bone was broken. And of course, it is obligatory for every Hebrew, every Israelite, every Jew to participate in this meal, the eating of this meal. All the congregation of Israel are to celebrate this. Now, if a stranger, here we go back to the stranger, that's not a foreigner passing through. A stranger is the resident alien, the one who lives among you. If the resident alien is to be accepted as anything more than just a foreigner passing through, then they must adhere to the rules. They must adhere to the laws of it. No migrants are coming in and participating in any of this stuff unless they completely and utterly obey those laws that are for them to obey, the laws of the land. If a stranger sojourns with you, in other words, if a Gentile from another country or another culture wants to live among you in the promised land, in Israel, and within your borders, in other words, and he wants to celebrate the Passover to the Lord, the only ticket that he has to the event is that he and his all the males in his family, his clan, must be circumcised. So not just him, whole clan. All the males must be circumcised. Then let him near to celebrate it, to come near to celebrate it. But he shall be like a native of the land. No uncircumcised person shall eat of it. God's standards must apply equally to both the Hebrews and the permanent resident aliens in the land without exception. Now, this is a very important point to remember for one reason. And the reason for us to focus on this is all of the Christ in the Passover and Messiah in the Passover seders that are being offered out there in the course of the holiday period, and so many churches involved in the Passover, and so many Messianics involved in the Passover. It's like the biggest event of the year. But according to the law, if you want to be faithful to Torah, and if you truly believe that Torah is still binding on you, the law of Moses is still binding on us, then all the Gentiles are not invited. It's only for Jews, unless you're circumcised. But who's going to check that ticket? Right? Talk about unreasonable search and seizure, right? And so we must, and it's funny, but it's tragic, because you have people who are preaching law and practicing grace. Because yes, I believe that we are under a new covenant, not under the Mosaic law anymore, and we are no longer forced to observe Passover. But why in the world would you not want to observe Passover? Because it speaks of such an amazing event, and in fact the Messiah fulfills the Passover in his death, burial, and resurrection. So why in the world, if you were a follower of Messiah, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, would you not want to do this? But you are forbidden. If you want to be a Torah-observant Gentile or a Torah-observant Jewish believer, Gentiles are excluded. If you want to observe the Passover, circumcision. Unless, of course, we're no longer actually under the Mosaic law. All right. No uncircumcised person shall eat of it. The same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger who sojourns among you. It's very important because, yes, you want your mixed multitude who is among you not to be a mixed up multitude. And unfortunately, the Messianic world is a very mixed up multitude right now. And there is a lot of confusion regarding how these laws and the Mosaic laws and the Mosaic covenant fit for believers today. And I'm showing you a passage right here that says very clearly, if you are not part of Israel as demonstrated by circumcision, Passover is not for you. But if you are a follower of the Messiah, if you have put your trust in the death, burial, and resurrection of our Messiah, and are under, therefore, a new and superior covenant that is not alongside the Mosaic covenant, as if we had two major figures in our lives, Moses and Jesus, sitting on equal plane. It's not the Messianic movement. This is not a Messianic congregation. It is a Messianic congregation. And the Messiah has pride of place and will share his pride of place with no one, not even Moses. And doesn't have to, because we are under the new covenant. Whoa, my goodness, I guess that's going to raise some questions, isn't it? Well, I want you to take your questions. I want you to think about them. Make sure that they're well-formed and crafted. Knead them together, put them together, bake them a little bit. And then I want you to share them with me. If you have questions about how this works and what we talked about today regarding Passover, regarding the new covenant versus the Mosaic covenant, and how to participate or whether to participate in any Jewish festivals, like, well, we have Hanukkah coming up, or like Passover coming up, well, this is the time I want you to ask me. If you're watching at home or on the computer or listening in the car, I want you to write, and I want you to ask those questions, and I'll be happy to answer those as well. Send an email, send a letter. They'll all be read, they'll all be addressed, they'll all be answered. And anyone here today who's got a question, those questions will be answered as well. So, next week, the redemption of the firstborn. Of the who? And the what? The redemption of the firstborn. What is it? I'm afraid I'll have to leave you in suspense.